So now we will talk about the fourth section of a paper or the thesis, the section where you discuss your findings or the results. And I think that in here is also kind of a tick box of you need to tick if you did all of this. But my suggestion is that now you should follow the order. I think it will be strange to start with the analysis of the regression before talking about descriptive statistics. So maybe now you should follow also my my advice on the order. So maybe you can even set like 3 subsections, like descriptive statistics, correlations, and then regression analysis. And let me start with the first part, descriptive statistics. Sometimes when we do statistics, like the regression model, we forget about descriptive statistics, but that's super important. We usually discuss the mean, the median, the minimum, max, and standard deviation. That's some example of things that you describe from descriptive statistics. So you say like, in average, in our sample, the happiness was 6 out of 10. So they are a little bit above average. So for example, something like that. That is what you have to discuss in this kind of short discussion. It's usually like one big paragraph, like a 1 page or something. So you set the table of the descriptive statistics. I will show you the table in a second. The table of the descriptive statistics, and then one paragraph discussing a little bit something interesting that comes in there. For example, you can highlight like the minimum of happiness was 3. So that means that in your sample, there is no one who is at the very low at 1. So that can be something interesting, or the mean again of the average of financial stability is 7. So it's very high. Like it seems that in this sample, everyone is quite stable financially. You can discuss all of these interesting things. They are only like descriptive, so you cannot test your hypothesis with that, but they are interesting. Then these 2 things we included, but I think they don't apply in here. There are many things that maybe sometimes they apply, sometimes they don't apply, but because it's a lecture, I need to talk about them. But for this project, I think they don't apply. And you need to reflect if they apply on your thesis later, but I think your supervisor will help a lot. Principal component analysis and bivariate tests. So the first one, PCA, is a method where you kind of when you have many variables, when you have many data, you can reduce the number of variables using this method, principal component analysis. I think that in most cases that doesn't apply because we usually think a lot, we spend a lot of time improving the survey. So the survey is not that big because there is risk that people won't answer. So we usually have like a short and very clear model. So we usually don't need this. So in our case, we won't do this. And the bivariate test is also is another statistical test where you check if the mean of the change on the mean on one of your variables is correlated with the change of the mean of the other variable. It's only between 2. So I think that is also not relevant because we're going to do the correlation, and in the correlation you somehow get that. So I think it's kind of doing this twice. If you read papers that they do it, they're usually in finance or in economics because they have like huge data sets, and then this is kind of useful. And it's also kind of how they do it in finance and economics, but in accounting, I think it's not that important. And because our samples are usually smaller. So the PCA and the t-test in the bivariate test, I think we won't do. But correlations, that will be the second section or subsection of this chapter or section on findings. And in there, you need to also, similar to the descriptive statistics, it's also a short discussion, but you will include your table of correlations, like book the table, and then one paragraph discussing interesting correlations. Maybe you can say like, it seems that there is correlation between financial stability and gender. I don't know. So you're saying like, it's quite interesting that in this sample, males seem to be more stable financially. I'm just making up things. Or age and financial stability. Maybe that is also a correlation because the older you get, the better income you have. But I don't know if something like that will pop up. So it's just kind of discussing interesting things. In the end, this is not like so conclusive because it's just a correlation. But that, so it's a very short discussion. And then this is the big discussion, the regression analysis. And that's actually the interesting part, because in the regression analysis is where you will support or reject your hypothesis. And as I said before, you will have at least 3 regressions for this assignment. One, where you only test your A and B, so happiness and financial stability. Then you will have another model where you will test with the original control. So it will be happiness and financial stability with age, gender, blah, blah, blah. Usually what happens in there is that this model is better than this one. I will explain that in the workshop, why that happens and what do I mean with better model. And then we will do a third model, adding controls, more controls, so the variables from the other groups. So we will do that. And I didn't write it in here, but because I say discussion of all. Basically, discussion of all means to discuss 3 things. In each model, you have to discuss 3 things. You need to discuss the model fit. I will talk about that. It's a statistic that SPSS will give you. And the idea in there is that if that statistic is below 0.1, so that means 90% significance, the model fits. The model fits means that you can interpret the model. If the model doesn't fit, if the model fit is very low, you cannot do anything with that model. You cannot even say is significant or not. The conclusion is the model fit is not correct, so, or is not significant, so you drop that model. So that's the first thing you need to test, the model fit. Maybe I should have written in there, but you write in your notes, model fit, that's number 1. The second one is the R-square. The R-square tells you how much of the variance of your dependent variable is explained by the model. If we were engineers, we would like to have a model that explains 99.99% of the variations, because imagine that you are building a model of an airplane, for example, like the wing of an airplane. You want to know 99.99999% of the variations of what happens with the wing, depending on all the factors that you add in your model. So you want to have a perfect model in that sense. In social science, that's impossible, because you cannot you cannot explain 99.99% of the behavior of someone, of the happiness. If you do that, you will win a Nobel Prize and you are probably good. But so that's why in social science, we are happy with maybe an R-square of around 25. So your model explains 25% of the change in happiness. That's okay. And it will be quite suspicious if you have more than 60 or something like that. I would say like maybe your sample is too small or something, or it's very biased, the answering. So the second thing to test is the R-square. In the R-square, it should be something in between 0.25 and 0.6, something like that. We will see in the workshop. And the last thing to check when you discuss the model is the actual significance of each variable, especially the independent variable. But I'm saying a lot of things and maybe you don't understand them, but in the workshop you will link it. So you will discuss if the variable is significant or not. That is the last thing, because sometimes people jump really quick into here. They ignore this, they ignore this, they ignore the model fit and the R-square, and then you go directly to test the variable, and then they reject or support the hypothesis based on that. But you need more than that. You need to pass all of these things. If you find something that doesn't work from all of this, then you need to stop before rejecting or suggest or supporting your hypothesis. Because based on the last discussion, the significance of the variable is when you support or reject. You support if the significance is below 90. We will also explain that in the workshop, and you will reject if it is below 90. But that is the last part. That is the last thing you will do, not the first. So, and you will do this 3 times, so probably 3 paragraphs. So before I move on to the next I want to show you this other file that we have in here. You have it in Canvas, where we give you an example of how the tables look like. You can also see papers and how they measure. This is in another, so the variables are different, but it is basically showing the number of observations. So it's a bit strange because it seems that 190 people answered, but or 190 companies, because this is company level, were captured in that database, but only 141 answered to this question. That's possible that can happen. That is not always the same number. Like imagine maybe in your survey someone answers the financial stability, but they don't answer the emotional stability because they don't want to or something. So maybe the end will be a bit different. That can happen. Then we have minimum and maximum. So here we have like 1 to 7, probably that is the scale they use. Here we have 0 and 1, so this is probably a dummy variable where there you can only have 1 or 0. So that's diversity. So is there diversity, yes or no? And then they have the average. So for example, it seems 2.9, it seems like it's below average, so maybe that's important to discuss. But 2.14, there is a lot of deviation. So although the mean is 2.9, there is high variation. So maybe that's also important to discuss. And something also nice about this structure of presenting the descriptive statistics is that you start with the independent variables. You will have only one independent variable. Here we have many. In this study we had 6, but you will have only one, so it will be easy to discuss this. Then we have the controls. So you will have more controls, and then you can set the controls. So that's just a way of showing it. But remember, you need to include the number, minimum, max, mean, and standard deviation, and discuss in one paragraph something interesting that you find. Then the correlation. When we do the workshop, I will show you how it looks like in SPSS. It's a bit odd, but in the correlation is always between -1 and 1. The closest it is to -1 or 1 means that the relationship is very strong. So for example, in here, it's even in bold. It seems that cultural diversity is highly correlated positively, because the number is positive, with cultural diversity. So factual and perceived diversity are very linked. Is that surprising? Maybe not. Maybe, and that's what you can discuss, like, it makes sense that factual and perceived, they are linked. And maybe it's not that surprising, but at least we know that factual and perceived are not so far away from each other. And then you can discuss other interesting things that you find. So for example, in here we have negative between boys and the perceived diversity. That's quite odd. That's quite interesting, that if there is more boys, there is less perceived diversity. That's interesting. Kind of descriptive result that you can quickly discuss. Of course, you cannot theorize from this, but it's just interesting to discuss. And then you see that we have these dots in here, the stars. SPSS will give you the significance of the correlation. So I think 2 stars is 99% significance of the correlation, and 1 star is 95, something like that. We'll see. So you also need to add the stars to show the strong correlations, because for example, here we have 0.028 or -0.11, and they don't have star. That means that the correlation is very weak, so SPSS doesn't highlight it. So you also need to include the stars and maybe discuss the ones that with the stars, and they are usually quite high in the number. And finally, the regression models. You will have probably 3 models, one without controls, with controls, and with controlling for other variables, or the variables from the other teams. And in here, you have to discuss, or you have to present the standard beta, the standard coefficient, the standard error. All of this comes from SPSS. I will show you how to do it, how to report it. And again, you have the stars in here. This is what I said about discussing the significance of the variable. The significance of the variable is just this. If this number has stars, that means that it is significant at certain degree. So for example, this, we will say, yes, they are significant, But I also say, don't do this first. This is the last thing you do, because before that, you need to discuss this, the model fit. I will also explain that when we have the workshop. But the model fit has to be significant, so it also has to have stars. The number doesn't matter, but what matters is the stars. So I think all of these models are fine, but these are not fine. These models don't work. So that's something that you need that if this is your thesis, then you cannot use this model. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just that these models don't, the model fit is not significant, so you cannot do it. So you will work with this tree. So this passed, and then the other thing that we need to talk about, that adjusted R-square is 6.5 is quite low, but maybe in this context, it's okay. So that's something we also need to discuss, that there is not like an absolute value for the R-square. It's a bit dependent on the context. So maybe in the context of diversity in companies, it's still okay to have this quite low R-square. Is 6.5% is quite low. So we discussed this, and this is super important. If it doesn't work, you cannot do anything else, you finish. Then the R-square, it depends on the context. Unless it's super high or it's 0, then you're in trouble, but we can make it work. And then the first thing is to discuss this, if the variable is significant or not. So I think a lot of things will make more sense once that we have the workshop, and then we do the SPSS. But maybe you come back to this when you're writing your thesis to this video. I think that's something nice about videos, and you can just go exactly to where I'm discussing something relevant. Well, there's only one more video on the discussion, the last section or chapter that is relevant to this topic, and then we are done.